In a quiet suburban neighborhood surrounded by lush greenery and tall trees, there lived a man named John Miller. He was an ordinary guy with an extraordinary passion for the outdoors. From a young age, John had been drawn to nature. Whether it was fishing in nearby streams, camping under starry skies, or tracking animals through dense forests, he found peace in the wilderness. But among all his hobbies, hunting held a special place in his heart. To him, it wasn't just about the thrill of the chase. It was about connecting with nature, understanding its rhythms, and respecting its balance. John's home sat on the edge of a sprawling woodland that stretched for miles. The forest was rich with wildlife. Deer grazed in open clearings, rabbits darted between bushes, and birds chirped from treetops. For years, John had explored these woods, knowing every trail like the back of his hand. It was his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the noise of daily life. Over time, he became skilled at hunting, always careful to follow ethical practices. He never took more than he needed, and he made sure to use every part of the animal he harvested. To John, this was a way of honoring nature rather than exploiting it. But things changed when the Homeowners Association, HOA, stepped in. The HOA was a group of residents tasked with maintaining order and enforcing rules within the neighborhood. They prided themselves on keeping the area pristine, ensuring everyone followed guidelines designed to preserve property values and community harmony. One of their most cherished initiatives was the creation of green spaces, areas of natural beauty set aside for recreation. These included hiking trails, picnic spots, and scenic overlooks that wound through the same woods John loved so much. At first, John didn't think much of the HOA's efforts. After all, the trails brought people closer to nature, which he believed was a good thing. However, tensions began to rise when rumors started circulating about someone hunting near the trails. Residents complained about gunshots echoing through the forest and claimed they felt unsafe walking their dogs or taking their kids on hikes. The HOA quickly sprang into action, drafting new regulations that explicitly banned hunting in any form within the designated green spaces. Signs went up along the trails warning violators of hefty fines and potential legal consequences. John tried to ignore the signs at first, assuming they wouldn't affect him. He'd hunted in those woods for years without causing trouble, and he saw no reason to stop now. Besides, he reasoned, the land wasn't technically owned by the HOA. It belonged to a private owner who permitted public access under informal agreements. As far as John was concerned, the HOA had no authority to dictate what he did out there. So he continued his usual routine, venturing into the woods early in the morning before anyone else was around. It wasn't long before trouble found him. One crisp autumn morning, while stalking a buck deep in the forest, John heard rustling behind him. Turning quickly, he came face to face with two men wearing bright orange vests emblazoned with the HOA logo. They introduced themselves as volunteer patrol members tasked with enforcing the new rules. Despite John's protests, they issued him a citation for illegal hunting activities and slapped him with a staggering fine of $5,000. Furious and humiliated, John stormed back to his house, clutching the ticket in his hand. How dare they accuse him of being reckless? He had spent decades learning how to hunt responsibly, always prioritizing safety and sustainability. And yet here he was, being treated like a criminal over something he considered a fundamental right. Determined to fight back, John attended the next HOA meeting, hoping to explain his side of the story. Standing in front of a room full of skeptical faces, John pleaded his case. He argued that hunting helped control deer populations, preventing overgrazing and reducing car accidents caused by animals wandering onto roads. He pointed out that he had never harmed anyone or damaged property during his hunts. But the HOA board dismissed his arguments, labeling him as selfish and dangerous. Their stance was clear: hunting would not be tolerated, period. As the meeting dragged on, John realized he wasn't going to win this battle, not with words anyway. His frustration boiled over, but instead of lashing out, he quietly vowed to take matters into his own hands. If the HOA wanted to play hardball, he would show them exactly what that meant. Little did they know, their decision to fine him would set off a chain reaction that would change the neighborhood forever. John's mind raced as he drove home from the HOA meeting. The weight of the $5,000 fine felt like a boulder on his chest, but it wasn't just the money that bothered him, it was the principle of the matter. He had done nothing wrong in his eyes, yet the HOA treated him like a criminal. Their refusal to listen to reason only fueled his determination to fight back. But how? He couldn't keep hunting if they were watching him so closely, and appealing to their sense of fairness clearly wasn't working. No, John needed a different approach, one that would hit them where it hurt. That night, unable to sleep, John sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a notebook. He started jotting down ideas, brainstorming ways to turn the tables on the HOA. His thoughts kept circling back to one key detail: the land, the trails, the woods, the entire green space that the HOA cherished so much. None of it actually belonged to them. It was leased from a private owner, which meant someone else held the real power over that land. If John could find out who owned it, maybe he could do something about it. The next morning, John headed to the county courthouse. He spent hours poring over property records, sifting through dusty files and outdated maps. At first, he found nothing useful. The land appeared to be part of a larger parcel owned by a corporation, but further digging revealed something surprising. The corporation had sold off portions of the property years ago. One of those sections included the very woods where John hunted, and it now belonged to an elderly couple named Margaret and Harold Peterson. Curious, John decided to pay the Petersons a visit. Their small farmhouse sat on the outskirts of town, surrounded by fields and old oak trees. When John knocked on the door, Margaret answered, her silver hair tied neatly in a bun. She looked surprised to see him, but invited him inside after he explained his intentions. Over cups of tea, John learned their story. Harold had inherited the land from his father decades ago, but neither of them had ever used it for anything meaningful. They allowed public access because it brought joy to others, but recently, mounting medical bills had forced them to consider selling. John saw an opportunity. "What if I bought the land?" he asked cautiously. Margaret and Harold exchanged glances, unsure what to make of this stranger offering to buy their property. John quickly reassured them, explaining his love for the woods and his desire to protect its future. He even offered them significantly more than the land was worth, a generous sum that would ease their financial burdens while giving him control over the area. At first, the Petersons hesitated. Selling such a large piece of land felt like letting go of a family legacy. But after discussing it privately, they agreed. They trusted John's sincerity and appreciated his willingness to help them during a difficult time. Within days, the paperwork was signed, and John became the proud new owner of the sprawling woodland that housed miles of hiking trails beloved by residents. As soon as the sale was finalized, John began making plans. He knew exactly what he wanted to do with the land, and it wasn't going to involve sharing it with anyone, not after the way the HOA had treated him. For weeks, he kept quiet, allowing the neighborhood to remain blissfully unaware of the change in ownership. People continued using the trails as usual, oblivious to the fact that their cherished green space no longer belonged to the community. But John wasn't idle. He hired surveyors to map out the boundaries of his newly acquired property and consulted with legal experts to ensure he understood his rights as the owner. He also reached out to contractors, arranging for materials to block off access points once he was ready to act. Every step of the process filled him with a mix of excitement and vindication. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about proving a point. The HOA had tried to dictate how he used the land, and now he would show them what happened when they crossed the wrong person. Finally, the day arrived. Early one Saturday morning, before most residents were awake, John arrived at the main entrance to the trail system. With a crew of workers and heavy equipment in tow, he set to work. Chainsaws buzzed as trees were felled across pathways. Bulldozers pushed dirt to create barriers, and tall metal gates were installed at every access point. By noon, the transformation was complete. Where there had once been open trails inviting exploration, there were now locked gates adorned with bold red signs reading, "Private property, no trespassing." Word spread quickly. Joggers returning from their morning runs found themselves blocked from entering the trails. Families planning weekend hikes discovered their favorite spots were suddenly off limits. Confusion turned to anger as people realized what had happened. Who would dare close off the trails? And why? It didn't take long for suspicion to fall on John. Neighbors recalled his clashes with the HOA and whispered about his possible involvement. Some dismissed the idea as absurd. Surely no one would go to such lengths over a fine, but others weren't so sure. As the truth came to light, outrage rippled through the community. How could John betray them like this? Didn't he care about the families who relied on the trails for exercise and recreation? To many, his actions seemed cruel and selfish, but John didn't care what they thought. Sitting in his living room later that evening, he watched news reports about the closure with a satisfied smile. The HOA had underestimated him, thinking a slap on the wrist would teach him a lesson. Instead, they had awakened a sleeping giant. Now, they, and everyone else, would learn what happened when you pushed John Miller too far. The morning after John closed off the trails, chaos erupted in the neighborhood. Residents woke up to find their beloved green spaces inaccessible, blocked by towering gates and forbidding signs. Social media buzzed with photos of the barricades, accompanied by angry captions questioning who could have done such a thing. Speculation ran wild. Was it developers looking to build on the land? A government agency reclaiming it for some undisclosed purpose? Or was it, as some whispered, an act of vengeance by someone within the community? By mid-morning, the truth began to emerge. Someone spotted John supervising the installation of a gate near the southern entrance to the trails. When questioned, he didn't deny his involvement. In fact, he seemed almost eager to confirm it. "I own this land now," he told a group of stunned neighbors. "And I've decided it's not open to the public anymore." His words spread like wildfire, leaving residents shocked and furious. Later that day, the HOA called an emergency meeting to address the situation. Normally, these gatherings were calm and orderly affairs, but this one felt more like a town hall on the brink of rebellion. The room was packed, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. Emotions ran high as residents took turns venting their frustrations. Some demanded answers, others hurled accusations at John, who sat quietly in the back corner, arms crossed, watching the storm unfold. When it was finally his turn to speak, John rose from his seat and walked to the front of the room. For a moment he stood silently, letting the murmurs die down before addressing the crowd. "You all know me," he began, his voice steady and measured. "I'm not some outsider trying to ruin your lives. I live here, just like you. But let me remind you of something. Not too long ago, you fined me $5,000 for doing something I believed was right. You accused me of being reckless, selfish, and dangerous. Now guess what? I own the land you've been using without permission, and I've decided it won't be misused anymore." The room exploded in shouts and jeers. People called him names, accusing him of being petty and vindictive. One woman stood up, tears streaming down her face, and pleaded with him to reopen the trails. "My son has asthma," she cried. "He needs fresh air and exercise. How can you take that away from us?" Another man, a regular hiker, angrily demanded to know how John could justify depriving the entire community of something they'd enjoyed for years. John listened patiently, his expression unreadable. When the noise died down again, he continued. "This isn't about punishing anyone," he said, though few believed him. "It's about teaching a lesson. You fined me for using the land responsibly. Now, if you want access to it, you'll have to negotiate with me directly. And trust me, my terms won't come cheap." His words only fueled the outrage. The HOA board members exchanged nervous glances, unsure how to handle the situation. They had never encountered anything like this before, a private citizen wielding so much power over communal resources. Desperate to regain control, they proposed forming a committee to discuss potential solutions. But John wasn't interested in compromise. He left the meeting early, leaving behind a room full of angry, frustrated neighbors. Over the following days, protests erupted outside John's house. Dozens of residents gathered daily, holding signs that read, "Reopen our trails," and "Shame on you, John Miller." Some even brought megaphones, chanting slogans loud enough to rattle windows. At first, John ignored them, staying indoors and going about his business as if nothing unusual was happening. But when the protests grew larger and louder, he decided to confront the crowd. Stepping onto his porch, he faced the sea of hostile faces with unwavering confidence. "Go ahead and shout all you want," he said, his voice carrying over the din. "Ow." "Go ahead and shout all you want," John said, his voice carrying over the din. "But nothing you say is going to change the fact that this land belongs to me now. You can protest until you're blue in the face, but those trails aren't opening unless I say so." The crowd erupted into a chorus of boos and jeers, some shaking their fists while others shouted insults. A few people even threw small objects, a crumpled soda can, a pebble, but John didn't flinch. He stood tall on his porch, arms crossed, wearing an expression that was equal parts defiance and amusement. To him, this wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about proving a point. The HOA had underestimated him once, and now they were paying the price. As the days turned into weeks, the protests outside John's house became a daily ritual. Parents brought their children, hoping to shame him into relenting by showing how much the trails meant to families. Joggers and hikers held up signs with photos of smiling kids playing in the woods, or couples walking hand in hand along scenic paths. Environmentalists joined the fray too, warning of the ecological consequences of closing off such a vital green space. They argued that blocking access could harm local wildlife, disrupt natural habitats, and lead to unchecked growth of invasive plant species. Despite the mounting pressure, John remained unmoved. He hired security guards to patrol his property and installed surveillance cameras around the perimeter to deter trespassers. Anyone caught climbing the fences or attempting to sneak onto the trails was promptly reported to the authorities. Word spread quickly. John wasn't bluffing. He intended to enforce his ownership rights to the fullest extent. Inside the HOA boardroom, tensions simmered as members debated their next move. Some advocated for legal action, arguing that years of public use had effectively turned the trails into a de facto public right-of-way. Others suggested launching a crowdfunding campaign to buy back the land from John, though no one was sure if he'd agree to sell, or at what price. Meanwhile, tempers flared among residents who felt abandoned by their leaders' inability to resolve the crisis. One particularly heated meeting ended with a dramatic proposal from Linda Harper, the HOA president. "What if we offer John a deal?" she suggested. "We'll drop the fine against him and pay him rent to reopen the trails temporarily. It's not ideal, but it might buy us time to figure out a long-term solution." The idea sparked fierce debate, with some board members accusing her of rewarding bad behavior while others saw it as their best chance to de-escalate the situation. Ultimately, the HOA decided to extend an olive branch. A delegation of 3 board members visited John's house late one evening, hoping to negotiate a truce. They arrived armed with charts and graphs detailing the economic and social benefits of keeping the trails open, as well as a written proposal outlining their temporary rental plan. But John dismissed them almost immediately. "I don't need your charts or your fancy proposals," he said, leaning back in his chair with a smirk. "If you want the trails reopened, here's my counteroffer. Pay me double what I spent to buy the land plus interest. That's non-negotiable." The board members exchanged horrified glances. The amount John was asking for was astronomical, far beyond what the HOA could afford without dipping into emergency funds or raising dues significantly. Defeated, the delegation returned to the boardroom empty-handed. News of John's outrageous demand leaked to the community, sparking fresh waves of anger and despair. Residents began organizing boycotts of businesses owned by HOA members, blaming them for failing to prevent the crisis. Others started looking for alternative outdoor spaces, only to discover that nearby parks were overcrowded and poorly maintained. The absence of the trails hit hard, especially as winter approached and indoor activities became less appealing. Amid the chaos, rumors swirled about John's true motives. Some speculated that he planned to sell the land to developers, transforming the once pristine forest into a sprawling housing complex or shopping center. Others believed he simply enjoyed watching the HOA squirm, relishing every moment of revenge. Whatever his reasons, one thing was clear. John had become public enemy number one in the neighborhood. But behind closed doors, cracks began to form in the united front against him. A small faction of residents, tired of the endless conflict, quietly reached out to John to explore private negotiations. Among them was Margaret Lewis, a retired teacher who lived 2 streets over. She had always been skeptical of the HOA's heavy-handed approach and sympathized with John's initial grievances. Over coffee at a local cafe, she broached the subject, cautiously. "Look, John," she said, stirring sugar into her cup. "I'm not saying what you did was right, but maybe there's a way to meet in the middle. Would you consider selling part of the land back to the community? We could set up a trust fund or something to ensure it stays protected." John listened thoughtfully, his usual smug demeanor softening slightly. For the first time since the standoff began, someone was treating him like a human being rather than a villain. Still, he shook his head. "I appreciate the effort, Margaret, but my mind's made up. If the HOA wants this land, they'll have to play by my rules." Though Margaret left the meeting empty-handed, she couldn't shake the feeling that John wasn't entirely unreasonable. Perhaps, she thought, there was still hope for reconciliation, if only someone could find the right leverage. Meanwhile, the HOA scrambled to salvage what remained of its reputation. They launched a PR campaign, issuing statements to local newspapers and TV stations portraying themselves as victims of an unreasonable neighbor. But the media coverage only amplified the controversy, painting the entire saga as a cautionary tale about power struggles and misplaced priorities. As the weeks dragged on, it became increasingly clear that neither side was willing to back down, and the impasse showed no signs of breaking anytime soon. For John, the standoff was both a victory and a burden. On one hand, he had successfully turned the tables on the HOA, forcing them to reckon with the consequences of their actions. On the other hand, the constant protests, legal threats, and whispered accusations weighed heavily on him. Friends stopped inviting him to barbecues. Neighbors avoided making eye contact when passing him on the street. Even his mailbox became a target for anonymous hate mail. Still, John refused to give in. Every morning, he woke up knowing he had the upper hand, and that knowledge kept him going. Whether it was worth the cost, however, remained to be seen. The stalemate between John and the HOA stretched on for months with no end in sight. The once vibrant trails had become a ghostly reminder of what the neighborhood had lost. Overgrown bushes crept onto the paths, and fallen leaves blanketed the ground where joggers used to run and children played. Residents adapted as best they could, driving farther to find hiking spots or settling for walks around the block. But the absence of their cherished green space lingered like an open wound, festering with resentment toward John. Behind the scenes, however, whispers of a solution began to circulate. A group of anonymous donors, wealthy individuals who preferred to remain unnamed, had taken notice of the situation. They saw the closure of the trails not just as a local issue but as a broader threat to public access to nature. Inspired by the community's passion for preserving the land, they pooled their resources and approached John with an offer he couldn't refuse. They would buy the property from him at double his original purchase price, plus additional compensation for legal fees and other expenses. John was skeptical at first. He had grown accustomed to holding all the cards and relished the power it gave him. Selling the land meant giving up that leverage and potentially losing face in front of the very people he had sought to humiliate. But when the donors presented him with the numbers, a staggering sum that would secure his financial future, he found himself reconsidering. After weeks of deliberation, he agreed to the deal, though he insisted on one condition. The transaction must remain confidential until after the sale was finalized. When news broke that the trails would be reopening under new ownership, the neighborhood erupted in celebration. Residents gathered in parks and driveways, sharing hugs and tears of relief. For many, it felt like a miracle, a second chance to reclaim something they thought was gone forever. The HOA issued a formal statement thanking the anonymous benefactors and vowing to ensure the land remained protected for generations to come. They announced plans to establish a non-profit trust fund specifically dedicated to maintaining the trails and preventing similar disputes in the future. But not everyone was ready to forgive and forget. As grateful as they were for the resolution, some residents struggled to move past the bitterness of the conflict. At a community meeting held shortly after the announcement, tensions flared once again. One man stood up and angrily accused the HOA of mismanaging the situation from the start. "If you hadn't fined John in the first place, none of this would have happened," he shouted, pointing a finger at the board members seated at the front of the room. Others echoed his sentiments, criticizing the HOA's lack of transparency and poor decision-making throughout the ordeal. The board president, Linda Harper, tried her best to defend the organization, emphasizing the lessons learned and promising reforms to prevent future conflicts. "We understand we made mistakes," she admitted, her voice tinged with regret. "But let's focus on moving forward together. This is our opportunity to rebuild, not just the trails, but our sense of unity as a community." Despite these efforts, the scars of the feud ran deep. Some neighbors continued to harbor grudges against John, refusing to acknowledge him even in passing. Others viewed him as a cautionary tale, a man who had let pride cloud his judgment and caused unnecessary suffering for everyone involved. And while John himself quietly moved out of the neighborhood shortly after completing the sale, rumors about him persisted. Was he truly remorseful for his actions? Or had he simply cashed out and walked away without a second thought? In truth, John's feelings were complicated. On one hand, he felt vindicated. He had proven his point, showing the HOA that their authority wasn't absolute and forcing them to pay dearly for their arrogance. On the other hand, the experience had taken a toll on him. The constant pressure, the isolation, and the weight of being labeled a villain had worn him down. In private moments, he sometimes wondered if there might have been a better way to handle things, if he could have fought back without causing so much collateral damage. As for the trails themselves, they slowly returned to their former glory. Volunteers organized cleanup events, clearing debris and repairing damaged sections of the paths. Donations poured in from across the country, inspired by stories of the community's resilience and determination. Local schools began using the area for environmental education programs, teaching students about conservation and sustainability. The land, once a source of division, became a symbol of hope and renewal. Years later, the story of John Miller and the HOA feud became legend in the area. It was recounted at dinner parties, shared in online forums, and even featured in documentaries about modern-day conflicts over land use. To some, John was a hero, a clever strategist who had outsmarted a bureaucratic system. To others, he was a villain whose thirst for revenge had harmed innocent people. But regardless of how they viewed him, everyone agreed on one thing. The incident served as a powerful reminder of the importance of compromise and communication. Today, visitors walking along the trails might never guess the drama that once unfolded there. Birds chirp in the trees, sunlight filters through the canopy, and families laugh as they explore winding paths surrounded by nature's beauty. Yet scattered reminders of the past remain, faded "no trespassing" signs nailed to old posts, rusted gates lying abandoned in the underbrush. These relics stand as silent witnesses to a chapter in the neighborhood's history, a testament to the complexities of human relationships and the enduring power of forgiveness. For John, life moved on. With the money from the sale, he bought a cabin in a remote mountain town, far away from the prying eyes of suburban communities. There, he returned to his love of hunting and solitude, finding peace in the quiet rhythms of the wilderness. Occasionally, he would think back to the standoff and wonder how things might have turned out differently if he had chosen another path. But more often than not, he pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the present moment, the crisp air, the sound of footsteps crunching through snow, the thrill of tracking game through untamed forests. And so, the story came full circle. What began as a simple disagreement over hunting rights ended as a lesson in pride, power, and the fragile balance between individual freedoms and communal responsibilities. While the wounds may never fully heal, the trails stand as a living monument to the resilience of both nature and humanity, a reminder that even in the face of conflict, there is always a way forward.